Speaker, welcome back to your own bus.
It's great to be here.
Oh, good. I'm glad. All right.
Chance to keep chatting.
Indeed. I want to talk about the economy. When we talk about the economy and the unemployment rate nationally is 8.5% unemployed, one of the things that is never sort of discussed is consumer spending, which is about 70% of our economic activity. But nobody wants to go out and spend money worried about unemployment. And so it's a little bit of a catch-22. If you were president, how would you convince the American people that, okay, it's a good risk to go out and spend money because when they buy things, consumer goods, that revs up the economy and helps the economy?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to start creating jobs. And if you build an American energy program, it both lowers the price of gasoline and creates more American jobs. And so the combination, the minute people start feeling comfortable that the job recovery is underway, they'll begin to feel comfortable about buying things. There's a lot of pent-up demand that is currently hidden by the fact that people are afraid. And so the minute you start reestablishing confidence that you have a pro-jobs plan that is real, and the minute they see it starting to work, I think you see an almost immediate rebound in consumer confidence and in the willingness to buy things.
Two problems. It'll take a while to create jobs. I mean, jobs aren't created overnight with any sort of plan. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we have an accumulated inventory, so people aren't going to be hiring so much. We've got to get rid of that inventory. It's got to get purchased first. So it really would behoove us if we could convince the American people that jobs they're there, they're coming. Go out and spend the money you may be hoarding right now.
Well, but I think it's important that they actually be there. And I think part of the reason people are very cautious is they've watched the mismanagement of this economy in the last 4 or 5 years in both parties. And they've had a sense of, why would I trust these guys? So I think one of the purposes of developing supply-side economics was the idea, if we make it really desirable to find oil and gas and coal and other American energy sources, that energy of going out and looking for that, building it, developing it, creates jobs. If we create the opportunity for people to invest and start creating jobs, almost overnight people will change their plans. I mean, I really believe the recovery begins late on election night when the American people realize Obama's gone. And I think my goal would be to ask the new Congress to come in on January 3rd, stay in session, and repeal Obamacare, Dodd-Frank, and Sarbanes-Oxley before I was sworn in on January 20th, so that I could sign the repeal literally within hours of becoming president. The reason is Obamacare threatens every small business, and so they just won't hire anybody. Dodd-Frank is killing small independent banks, cutting off financing for small business, and driving down the price of housing. And Sarbanes-Oxley adds a great deal of bureaucracy and red tape and cost with almost no benefit. So here are businesses that see themselves oppressed by all this new regulation, see themselves oppressed by the inability to borrow money and do the normal business things. If you liberated that in the first couple of weeks of January, you would be surprised how rapidly you'd begin to see a recovery take momentum.
How fast? I mean, because we really are in a situation desperate. And if you even look at the numbers here in Florida, the unemployment level now in December 2011 is 9.9%, which is even above the national average. And so, it isn't just sort of like an interesting intellectual discussion for people. It's a real problem. Right. How fast could you do it?
I think parts of it can happen within 6 months to a year. I mean, if you look at North Dakota, because the Bakken field formation is in private land, the liberals couldn't stop it being developed. They now believe they have 25 times as much oil as the U.S. Geological Survey thought 10 years ago. Their unemployment rate's 3.2%. They've cut taxes at the state level 7 times because it just keeps growing revenue. So you turn and you say, what if the president allowed, well, the brand new president says, you can develop oil and gas offshore Louisiana and offshore Texas, you can develop it in the Chukchi Sea off of Alaska. You can, any state that wants to could pass a request to develop it. So Virginia, for example, which already has a bill in the Senate. You would literally overnight have people looking at setting up exploration teams, buying equipment, hiring people, starting to move towards making a profit. Do 10 things like that in the first few weeks, and you suddenly have a lot of pockets of entrepreneurial activity that begin to feed off each other. And you rapidly turn this around, in my judgment. Reagan had, by the way, a very deep recession that he inherited from Jimmy Carter. But by October of 1982, within less than a year, about a year and a half after he initially took office, the recovery had started. And by 1983, we were adding lots of jobs every month.
Housing in the state is also a nightmare. Every place you go, people are being foreclosed on. Probably, I don't know if it's a more rapid rate than other parts of the country, but it's terrible here. What would your national policies do that would in any way help relieve any of the suffering here in this state?
Well, first of all, if you repeal Dodd-Frank, you immediately improve the ability to get housing loans. Because part of the impact of Dodd-Frank has been federal regulators saying, don't make a loan on housing. So you overnight make that easier.
But people don't necessarily have the jobs to pay the notes on the housing. I mean, there's a little bit of a problem there.
But that's part one. Part two is we're looking at seriously is to potentially offer a tax break on your losses. So if you do have to sell your house and it is underwater and you're going to lose money, you could at least take that as a deduction, say over a 5-year period, which would ease some of the financial pain and help people start to recover. I mean, you got to look at that. Part three is, I think, to break Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two gigantic institutions, into probably 5 institutions each. So you have smaller, regional, less risky institutions that are more manageable, and then to gradually wean them off of federal government sponsorship over a 5 or 8 year period. But the biggest thing about the housing recovery, other than repealing Dodd-Frank, has to be finding a way to get the economy going. If you're at 9 or 10% unemployment, 9.9% in Florida, you have too big a zone of people who don't have any money. And when you're down at 4.2%, which is where it was when I left the speakership, folks are out there, they're earning a living, they're getting promoted, they're optimistic.
They're consuming.
They're consuming,
right.
Including consuming houses.
Right, but they're not consuming now.
Right.
I mean, so it all
That's why we're in a trap. And the big argument between the Keynesians who said stimulate demand and the supply siders who said stimulate investment is an argument over which one in the long run works better. I believe you have a whole world market out there. If we were to stimulate American development, this is why we have 100% expensing so that all new equipment gets written off in 1 year. Because I want the American workers to have the most modern equipment in the world, so we're literally selling all over the world. So you have a tremendous American export industry being born again. All of that, again, creates real jobs, earning real money in a way that's pretty powerful.
Why don't you have more friends in high places here in this state? Governor Jeb Bush, he hasn't endorsed, but he jabbed you a little bit recently. Senator Rubio has jabbed you over an ad that you've actually taken down.
But Marco and I talked the other day, and I think we're in pretty good shape. Jeb and I have known each other a long time. Governor Rick Scott has been very helpful in private conversations. Bill McCollum, who was the other candidate for governor, is chairing my campaign statewide.
But why isn't Jeb Bush? He didn't endorse you.
Well, I wish he would.
How about Governor Rick Scott?
I think he's trying to help everybody, but not necessarily get drawn in the middle of the fight.
So, are you saying it's because they're sort of politically protective of themselves, or?
Look, I think almost every state in the country, the establishment is not going to take a big risk on Newt Gingrich. Go back and look at South Carolina. You know, the governor was for Mitt Romney. All I had were people. Well, you look around this state. I mean, you look at the size of the crowds. We have lots and lots of people, and the question is going to be, can we generate enough people power to offset Romney's money power?
And?
Oh, I think we will. You know, the history of America is that popular insurgencies usually beat establishments, particularly in a period when people are feeling pain and they're angry. They're going, you know, why would I vote for him?
Let's talk foreign policy. Egypt is undergoing an incredible transformation right now. A lot of fear that it's going to it's not going to go our way. We have Ray LaHood, Secretary of Transportation's son, who cannot leave Egypt right now. Israel is worried about what happens in Egypt. Would your foreign policy be any different than the president's foreign policy as it relates, I guess, to Egypt and all the countries surrounding?
Yeah, I think we need to very fundamentally rethink everything we think we know about the region. I think that we are on the edge of catastrophic change, almost all of it anti-American. And it's one of those periods, it's a little bit like when a tornado comes through or when a hurricane comes through. You don't know what's going to happen next. I mean, the scale of the change is so, for example, in Egypt, about 75% of the votes in this first round went to the Muslim Brotherhood and more Islamic groups in the Muslim Brotherhood. So you now have a pressure building for the Muslim Brotherhood to move towards an even more radical position.
Which hurts, or I would think would put Israel on end, because Egypt,
right,
under Mubarak at least, was friendlier towards Israel.
Well, it hurts Israel, it hurts the United States, it hurts the forces of modernization, it hurts the role of women. It's a reversion to a much more medieval style of life. And I think it's a very serious challenge. I mean, I think it's enormously serious.
Would your foreign policy be more engaging than President Obama, or would you sort of step back more?
No, I would be more engaged, but with some kind of strategy and some kind of understanding. I mean, we're not going to change Ahmadinejad. We're not going to change the new leadership in Libya. We ought to think about, can we in the long run find a next generation of leaders, and can we in the long run shape those societies? But these are people who are pretty clear about what they want to do, and very little of it is good for the United States.
What would you do about Ahmadinejad? I mean, he says now that he wants to restart talks with the world about nuclear weapons.
Well, I mean, he could easily prove that by dismantling his program. I think he just plays everybody for fools.
So what would you do?
I would try to use the same techniques and strategies that President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher and Pope John Paul II used against the Soviet Empire. And I would try to, I would have as a conscious goal replacing the dictatorship.
Which means what? Well, I mean, how would you do it? There are a couple ways to do it.
It means you covertly help every dissident group, you covertly help the students, you create an environment where people realize that there's tremendous support for change. You communicate that if in fact they do start something at the Straits of Hormuz, it's the end of the regime.
And if that covert project doesn't work, and
then you have a huge problem.
And then we have a huge problem, and time marches on, then what?
I mean, if you came down to a choice of using military force or accepting an Iranian nuclear weapon, you would have no choice except to use force. And you cannot take the risk of losing an American city to an Iranian nuclear weapon.
And do we do that ourselves, or do we engage others, and what about Israel?
I think you would be prepared to work with anybody who agreed with you, but you would also be prepared to go alone if necessary.
You know, all these decisions really are very dependent on the level of our intelligence. I don't mean our intellectual intelligence, but how good we are at gathering intelligence. And we've had such enormous problems with gathering intelligence being a factor. Is there anything that you could do, would do, if you were president, that would improve our confidence in our intelligence gathering?
Yeah, I'd ask the Congress to repeal most of the laws which cripple the intelligence community and allow them to go back to actually spying.
Meaning?
You want covert agents who operate in countries and genuinely try to understand what's going on without relying on local governments and local intelligence systems.